Hello, my name is Dr. David Bray. I am honored to be joining with one of my colleagues and friends, Dr. Divya Chander. We're here to talk today about this idea of an immune system for the planet. But real quick first, Divya, could you give us like the 15-second thumbnail as to who you are and what do you do?
Yeah, sure. I'm an anesthesiologist and critical care doctor. I've worked a lot with COVID patients, actually. I'm also a neuroscientist who studies the basis of consciousness and a data scientist. And of course, I work with you, my friend and colleague at the Atlantic Council.
Indeed, and we are so fortunate to have you at the Atlantic Council, and more importantly, just I know we've done things even beyond that with Singularity University, other speaking events.
Mhm.
I always find Divya, I mean, whether it's talking about data science, cybersecurity, public health, I always find I learn from what you're sharing, and so I think today we're here to talk about this idea of that we could actually have a global immune system for the planet, and maybe if maybe you want to sort of kick it off, and then I can build and riff on it. If you had to explain to people first, why do we even need to think about a global immune system for the planet, and then how might it operate?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this COVID pandemic, this was a test run. It's probably going to happen again. And it's disrupted health, economic security. It's affected the most vulnerable. Pathogens know no borders. And so we're in this together as a planet. And so the question is, can we do something to almost create the equivalent of an immune system for our planet in the same way that our bodies have it, their own innate immune systems? And I'm actually going to break this down in biological terms because it actually makes a lot more sense. So our immune systems, human immune systems, but actually most organisms on this planet have two kinds of immune systems. One is this more innate immune system. It's this sort of background surveillance system. It's an older system. And what it does is it tries to form barriers to invaders, to our bodies. It recognizes that things are foreign or other coming in, and it generally mobilizes defenses to the site of entry. And it kind of contains these invaders and deactivates them. This is something that we might be able to apply on a more general level to surveilling our planet for these kinds of things that potentially are harmful to humans. But then we have this adaptive immune system that is really, really specific for a particular kind of invader. And our bodies go through this entire sequence in which things that are recognized to be other than us are presented, and we form specific defenses. And what would be so interesting is if we can marshal both the artificial and the more biological aspects of our entire interconnected globe to create this kind of early warning system for the entire planet.
Well said. And if I could build on what you said and make it sort of give some historical precedent that this is possible for the listeners. Back in 2000, I signed up for a little known program called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program. We were only 30 people in the United States. We worked at the Centers for Disease Control, which itself at the time was 15,000 people. So we were 30 people in the basement that were there if a really bad day happened. And every 6 months or so, Congress said we were a Cold War relic that did not need to exist. It was scheduled weeks in advance for me to give a briefing to the CIA and the FBI as to what we would do technology-wise if a really bad day happened. That briefing just happened to be scheduled in advance for September 11th, 2001 at 9 o'clock in the morning. Of course, unfortunately, 8:34, tragedy hit. We piled computers into cars and we dealt with the response to both New York and DC. Didn't sleep for about 3 weeks, stood down from high alert on October 1st. Flew up to Langley to actually brief the CIA on October 3rd, only to then fly back to Atlanta and have the first case of anthrax show up on October 4th. And I jokingly said, I will never brief you guys again because bad things happen. But I raise that because one of the things that we did in the bioterrorism program before 9/11, and we also did afterwards, was anytime there was a VIP event, perhaps the president is speaking somewhere, perhaps there's an assembly of a lot of different heads of state, we would go in about 3 or 5 days in advance. And we'd establish what the baseline looked like. That baseline would include what is the normal rates for school absenteeism? What's the normal rate for 911 calls? What's the normal rate for, in terms of over-the-counter drugs, medications, especially medications that involve either respiratory distress or gastrointestinal distress? And you'd establish what that normal baseline would look like. And then when the VIP event would happen, if all of a sudden you saw a spike, it's not saying guarantee there's a bioterrorism event, but it's enough to make you go, something's going on here. And so one of the things that we saw at the time when that happened was when it was it was after 9/11, but we were doing a VIP event. We actually had a case where it was a big sporting event, and all of a sudden we saw a spike right after the sporting event in gastrointestinal medication sales. Now, the good news is that wasn't because of a bioterrorism event. It was just because of what people ate after the Super Bowl events that happened. But I raise that because when that happens and you see that spike, it's still telling you something that's important. Later, when it was 2003, we did actually know about severe acute respiratory syndrome about 5.5 months before China said anything, and we knew because of two ways. One was you could actually see the price of garlic spiking in that part of China. In China, they actually see garlic as a cure-all. So if all of a sudden there's a huge demand and the price goes up, that actually indicates that there's something going on where people feel like they need to have a cure-all. But the other reason why you could also tell was at the time it was government satellites, but now you can do it with commercial satellites. We saw patterns of life change. So we weren't tracking any one person. We weren't trying to actually, do surveillance on people in terms of individual people. It was just general patterns of life, and we could actually see that people weren't going to factories, people were going to hospitals. And sure enough, when you look at what happened with COVID-19, price of garlic spikes, and sure enough, people stop going to factories and workplaces, and they're going to hospitals as well. So I'll hand this back to you, Divya. I know you've put a lot of thought in this as well. What are other things that we could possibly monitor that could help inform of a possible immune event or an event where it's either bioterrorism or some other pandemic?
Yeah, let me riff a little bit off these, what look like they're going to be artificial signals, not biological signals, but they truly give us an indication. So for COVID, well in advance, actually, of the of this crisis breaking out, and any of us recognizing it, there were a number of searches, and they weren't just in English. They were all through, say, Latin America and Europe. And the search question was, I can't smell. I can't smell, right? Now, nobody knew why people would be searching for this, but when you get a spike in an interesting kind of inquiry like that, it might lead you to consider that something might be going on in the world. Another thing, David, you were talking about patterns from space. Space is our friend here. Energy usage changes. If you look at where the lights are concentrated at night from, as we're, imaging the Earth, you'll actually see completely changed patterns of human activity and migration. Another really cool one is looking from space. There are actual satellites that have been tracking animal migrations. And in some cases, some of these animals have actually been instrumented with biosensors that are so sensitive that they can detect changes in physiological parameters like their heart rate and even their body temperature. So a lot of this pandemic stuff, it's spreading from other animals, right? This is zoonotic spread. And if you see a spike in temperatures, for instance, in waterfowl, ducks, geese, things like that, which they've actually been able to do from space, you might infer actually that a group of animals are getting sick. And these are animals that are actually kind of on the edge of where they may be interacting with humans, and that we might need to consider that we might have to go in there to, say, mitigate a crisis. Another really important and interesting one is wastewater surveillance, which I know, David, is really near and dear to your heart as well. Wastewater surveillance is a very interesting and cool thing. One, what you do is, everything we flush down our toilet actually contains evidence, and a lot of people don't realize that they're shedding virus in their feces. And if you can capture it in an area that's pooled, so you don't necessarily link it to exactly one individual, but you can get, say, a sort of a smaller geographic location, you can start to search for signatures of viruses and bacteria within the wastewater and identify outbreaks before they happen. And you can actually then begin to quarantine communities and test them if you need to. And it turns out when they went back and looked at wastewater, they were able to detect the SARS-CoV-2 genome within the wastewater in both Spain and Italy as far back as October, November of 2019. So if we had actually had a wastewater surveillance system in place, we would have also picked up that biosignature. And the cool thing is that you can use that same wastewater surveillance technology and just kind of slot in a new flashlight for each kind of pathogen. And it doesn't take very much. And then you can actually search for other pathogens at the same time.
Well said. And I think you also, I appreciate you stress that we're talking about pooling. So it's not going to say it's a specific person, because we don't really want to have it be specific people. We still value individual freedoms, individual choice, and civil liberties, but it's also about collective health. And so the idea is if you pool it at the neighborhood level or something like that, you're not saying it's specifically this house, it's just that knowing in this neighborhood there's something that goes on that is of common concern. And I think the same thing is true when we talk about assets from space. It's about patterns of life versus individuals. Another colleague, Dr. Rita Caldwell, who was also involved in response to 9/11, she's actually looking at picking up indications of cholera from space as well. So that's just another sign of other public health outbreaks that can be detected. And I raise that because it is going to be a case as to how we use these technologies in a way that still embraces individual choice, individual freedoms. And it's also recognizing that, people might say, well, COVID-19, supposedly 1 in 100 a year event, is this going to happen again with more frequency? I think what I would say, and then I'd be interested in your thoughts too, Divya, is that there's two things. One, the supposed 1 in 100 year events seem to be increasing in frequency, and it may be partly because of climate change, and may also be how we humans have changed the planet. But now we're in the era in which humans have left a dramatic impact on the planet, and we are connected now more than ever. I would say things that seemed like once in a century pandemic might occur with increasing frequency. And so if we can get ahead of that, that's great. But the other reason is, the good news is, as I tell people, personalized medicine is coming. Mm-hmm. Personalized medicine is coming, which means, at least 2 of the vaccines that are being used in the United States were both designed in a computer and printed nucleotide by nucleotide, which is great. I mean, that's something you could not have done when SARS happened in 2003. It took more than 3 years to get a vaccine there, whereas we got vaccines within a year. But when you can design something in a computer, test it, and then actually print it nucleotide by nucleotide, yes, in this case, it was used as a force for good. But what happens if someone says, I'm really angry, or I really want to do something, that's disruptive? And so if we're going into an era in which we don't have to worry about not just natural pandemics and natural pathogens, but people that are just disgruntled that actually want to release this, and maybe they don't want to take out everybody, but they just want to take out a certain group, we're going to need these equivalents of smoke alarms and fire alarms for the planet. But I'd be interested in your thoughts too, Divya, as to why this is an imperative now for us to lay the groundwork for this future.
Yeah, wow, you said a lot of things. So let me see if I can break this into 3 things I heard. One is that we can potentially use a proliferation almost of connected IoT devices. As we know, there are at least 3 to 5 times as many IoT devices that are online now as there are humans on this planet. And that's in 2021. That's an exponential curve. And soon, I would say IoT devices are going to be swarming around us, almost like nanopathogens in the environment. Every single one of those has the capacity to take a signal and move it to a location in which that signal can be processed and identified to create an answer. So we can either process this information centrally, or as our computing power increases via Moore's law. And by the way, with the advent of things like neuromorphic computing, which means chips are being designed to compute as efficiently as your brain, and your brain uses the processing power of a dim light bulb to do all the work that it does. That's how efficient your brain is. It has a lot of noise, but it's really efficient. So we have neuromorphic computing come online. And then IBM recently created transistors that were so small, they were smaller than strands of DNA, and they were able to pack 50 billion of these transistors onto a chip the size of a fingernail. So what does that mean for normal people? Everybody keeps upgrading their smartwatches, their phones, laptops, you name it. All these smart devices, your Nest, your nanny cam, whatever you've got working at the edge is going to have this exponential increase in computing power. That's going to enable AI to happen at the edge. So we can use algorithms to actually maybe detect that there is a pathogen in your environment. I don't know, David, maybe your son brought something home, and all these integrated devices you have might give you an answer. What might be interesting about that is that that information doesn't have to go anywhere else if you don't want it to, right? If we create those systems in the right way, we can protect your privacy. So again, theme 1 is this proliferation of IoT devices, and how can we use this in the service of creating this immune system for the planet, and how do we create the underlying networks that still protect civil liberties as we do that? The second thing is, you mentioned, is this really a 1 in a century event? And you don't think it is. And I 1,000% agree with you. I think the 2 big trends that are really going to drive this are climate change, as you mentioned. And here's another example. The permafrost is melting. And with that permafrost are pathogens, viruses that are so ancient. They are millions of years old, we don't have an adaptive immune system that knows how to deal with them. And in the name of research, there have been some groups that are actually taking some of these things out of mammoths that have been buried in the ice, out of their skulls and things of that. As David mentioned, once you have a sequence, you can reprint it, right? So think of this almost as a copying machine, right? So you get the alphabet sequence. So now, one, you've exposed actual biological pathogens to an environment, to a bunch of organisms that have never seen them before. So they have evolved no mechanism to fight these off. And the second is you have a whole bunch of new codes for synthetic biology that have been created. And so let's go to that last thing you mentioned, the synthetic biology risks. I think that what might have to happen, David, are two things. One, we might need to embed almost like a nucleic acid. By the way, nucleic acids are the little alphabets that we use to create the code of life. And when we create artificial organisms by putting together this alphabet, I think it's really important that if you're actually doing this for the sake of good, maybe to create an mRNA vaccine or to create something to study it for human health, that we put a nucleic acid or this little alphabet like watermark into that synthetic organism we just created, so that you can signal to other people that, hey, this one was created by the people who don't want to hurt you. And this is, if you don't see the watermark, you might actually infer that perhaps this is a sequence that's being released into the wild, perhaps maybe not to do good. And that brings me to another point. I think that for these kinds of organisms, we might be not just having to create a global immune system, but new digital immune systems for humans, right? I think we're going to actually have to augment our native immunity that we evolved with biologically. So for instance, maybe like taking your vitamin supplement in the morning, you might actually have to inhale or spray something into your nose, almost like afro-nasal spray, but it's actually a bunch of like little nanoparticles. And those guys are going to go through your bloodstream and start scavenging for things that your normal immune cells were never programmed to look for. And we can update them just like we update our antiviral software in our computer or malware, and there could be frequent updates to that. Another one is for biosecurity is maybe we'll have to create almost digital noise fields around ourselves to protect us from other kinds of interference, because the biological threats might come from energy rather than pathogens. And that's actually going to require yet another kind of immune protection. So I see the world going to a place where perhaps augmenting our immune systems in these artificial ways is going to become a necessity. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Oh, I agree with you 100%, Divya. And I'm glad you went there talking about the what does it mean for people too. You mentioned first, sort of going backwards, you talked about energy. There have been some inquiries, nothing confirmed, but going back to 2016, that have we seen directed energy weapons possibly used in Cuba on U.S. personnel there? Have U.S. personnel even in D.C. possibly had directed? And again, don't know. It's probably in a world that it's some file somewhere else that we're never going to see. But it is going to come in a day in which we're not just going to be exposed to possibly do-it-yourself personalized medicine that is weaponized, but other things that are trying to target our body. And we do know, for example, there's already one early example. So for hunters, if you wear suits that actually have silver lining in them, and it actually is electrified slightly, that'll actually kill the aerosolized compounds that are around you so that there's not a scent. And so that's early technologies that could also be used to address if someone decides to expose your body to an aerosolized compound that you have not given consent to, we may be actually be able to have your clothes serve as a defensive response to that. But you're absolutely right as well. If we're going into a world in which directed energy weapons can give you a really bad headache or worse, yeah, what if you're going for a job interview and someone tries to take it out? And so I think this is the natural consequence of what you and I often talk about in terms of exponential change, which is technology is being democratized. And you can do wonderful things with it. You can do also a lot of mundane things with it, like cat videos and things like that. But some people are going to use it for bad purposes. And maybe to put this in a slightly related realm, which is everything we're seeing in the cybersecurity realm is coming to bio. all
That's
the bad
right.
things and things like that. And even if you go to cybersecurity, like the very metaphors we use of like antivirus and things like that, they come from the biological realm. But we're going to see this crossover, and it's worth noting out that in ransomware, so 2008, $5 billion globally in damages caused by ransomware. By 1 year later, 2019, it was up to 11.2 billion. By 2020, it was up to 20 billion. And all projections for this year is it's going to be somewhere between 35 and $40 billion in damages for ransomware. The average demand for ransomware in 2019 was about a little bit less than 7,000 US dollars. 1 year later, it was up to about 83,000 US dollars. And this year, it's now a little bit more than 230,000 US dollars. So that's not doubling. That is definitely something that's a little bit more geometric. But I know you have thoughts on this as well about how we can think about securing your own personal data. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, Divya.
Yeah, and it's actually bringing to mind the recent, the oil pipeline, the Capital gas pipeline, that had also been subject to ransomware, and that was what, a $5 million. But that group, DarkSide, I mean, they actually, I think they actually sent out ransomware for a whole bunch of, so they made a whole bunch of money off that, and then they said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we felt so bad about it."
We just want to make money. We just want to make money.
We don't want to hurt people.
We don't want to disrupt anything.
The U.S. healthcare system, by the way, I looked into this, and in 2020, it was at about 21 billion in ransomware attacks. And when U.S. healthcare systems, like a hospital system, gets hacked, not only can they hold that system hostage for that ransom, but there are major consequences to people's lives, right? Cancer patients don't get their drug treatments, people can't be seen, surgeries get canceled. So there's really a massive impact on human life when those attacks take place. And so I would say that, David, you and I probably agree that their security is going to have to be a multi-pronged approach. It's going to be everything from good individual hygiene, and that's like our own devices and how we protect them, two-factor authentication, changing passwords, doing all the needed things that we have to do to protect our own devices. But also, I think at a systemic level, the internet was built on telephone protocols, right? We swap addresses so that I can call you, and you and I each have an address, and the connection understands those two addresses. And that's how the internet was built. If I find the address and I can get in, I've hacked your line. And everything that you hold near and dear that's within that address is now open. And so alternate architectures which might maybe consider addressing security at an even deeper level so that a single hack into one location with one address doesn't compromise everything, that might be another kind of solution. But I feel like education is a really big part of this, because I'm not entirely sure that the general public realizes their level of exposure. We spent a lot of today like talking to my mom about this kind of stuff, and just trying to help her understand. So she's become more suspicious of things, which is really wonderful, and she reaches out. But I think that kind of personal education about where our vulnerabilities are going to be really important to keeping us all protected as a society.
Well said, and echoing on what you said, it's interesting because I do agree. Most people are, in some respects, maybe blissfully unaware, because once you actually peek beneath the veer, it's kind of hard to sleep. But you're absolutely right. It seems like the challenges and the concerns are in the invisible spaces, whether they be in the digital realm with cybersecurity. There's also the question of how do you know for sure that that hardware device you got hasn't had a very small chip that's smaller than a grain of sand added to it that is now doing something completely different than what Apple intended for it to do, or what Google, or you travel to another country, you leave your thing in your hotel and you come back and you think your laptop's perfectly fine, but something's been added to it while you were out in your hotel room. How do you know that hasn't happened? And so, the supply chain security, cybersecurity, bio, and then of course, there's obviously the information space. Misinformation, disinformation continue to be really big concerns. And obviously there's questions about what's happening domestically in different countries, but it's also recognizing that this is being weaponized also in what is this gray zone between it's not exactly peacetime, but it's not exactly war. I won't name the name of the countries, but there are some countries that what they do is they manage to hack It's not the United States. It's not any Western country. So that'll help at least caveat that. But there are countries that will compromise the names of soldiers, get their family members' names and get their cell phone numbers, and they will call their family members and say, soldier so-and-so has been killed in the line of duty, which of course hasn't happened. But now that soldier is getting calls from all these different family members saying, we got word that you were dead, what's going on here? You haven't fired a single shot, but you have managed to kill morale. You've made people distracted. You've made them not focus on what's going on at hand. And again, it's this sort of gray zone conflict. And so I would submit, if we're not careful, this decade ahead, if we're not careful, will be a new cognitive Cold War of sorts, in which the invisible spaces that include bio, that include cybersecurity, that include supply chain, include misinformation, disinformation, are making us all distrustful of any institution and pull us apart. But if we're intentional about saying, look, we can come together, we can still have personal freedom, we don't have to give into surveillance state, but we can still find a way to navigate this together where you can be protected and the whole can be protected, that I think could be a way to move forward for different nations that still believe in common good and ways of actually rallying. So maybe, Divya, I'd be interested in your thoughts, because you've seen government, you've seen private sector. How do we make this happen? I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Oh, how do we make this happen? Well, I think you said something that, and I feel like everything hinges on this, and that's the trust issue. One space where all of those different things you were mentioning come together were in the vaccine space, for instance, right? The disinformation campaigns you were talking about, but also this distrust in medical supply chain. That's not how people think about it. But when you're afraid that getting a vaccination is going to microchip you, what you're actually afraid about is that something got inserted into that vaccine that's there to track you. And that's really a breakdown of trust systems. So I think that trust is a hard one, because trust never happens at these large levels. Trust is a really local phenomenon, and it's a community phenomenon. It's a human phenomenon. It's about the stories we tell. It's about who we have already given our trust to in the past. They've done something to make us trust them. And once we assign that trust, we're actually really unlikely to take that away. And so if we want to transmit messages of trust, but also educate people about all these risks and vulnerabilities, the true ones, not the disinformation or misinformation ones, I think we have to enlist community members on the ground and yes, and just do a much, much better job at that kind of storytelling. I also personally wish a lot of these trust issues and these things that were matters of public safety, security, and health didn't keep ending up in the political arena to be spun in this really strange way that they are, because then they become weaponized. So I'd also be interested in hearing your thoughts, but I'm even interested in hearing what you think about the way new alliances are forming planet side that are kind of moving into space. And here I mean like real space.
Right, outer space. So I'll tackle that in a moment and sort of build on what you said about, the trouble of how these questions about public safety, security get politicized. And in some respects, this is a challenge of Western representative governments, that we elect politicians with the idea that their very ambition checks the ambition of other politicians. You go back to the founders, at least in the United States, they said, what is government but the greatest reflection of humanity? If all men and women were angels, no government would be necessary. And so they won it, and they actually said ambition to counter ambition. That's all well and good until you now have this world of global reach and everything like that. And the very ambition weaponizes some of these conversations that actually play to polarization. I can share from personal experience back in 2017, I did observe something that was quite clearly not normal. It looked like we were receiving at a government agency, we normally would receive less than 1 million comments. And all of a sudden in less than 2 weeks, we'd received more than 2 million. And people are like, oh, it's all real people. And I'm like, there's no way that's real people. But the trouble was we had to receive all the comments, even if they were being submitted by a bot. We couldn't block them, even if they were spam comments or ridiculous comments. We had earlier had about 5 years ago on a similar proceeding, we had gotten War and Peace uploaded multiple times, and we can't block that because technically we're supposed to receive everything. But what we saw was this was actually denying actual individuals from getting comments, and it was crowding out the space, and it was denying them resources. So I called it at the time, and unfortunately, both sides of the political aisle said, nope, nope, that David Bray is wrong, everything like that. Fortunately, those who knew me said, yeah, we know David. Why would he make something like that up? Press forward, and it wasn't until about 4 years later, just last month, that the New York Attorney General came back and said, yep, out of the 22 million comments received, 18 million were from dubious sources of origin. 9 million came from one political party that was on a certain side, and 9 million came from a different political party. So both political parties were in it. Some had hired some companies, whereas the other one was a 19-year-old kid. So I don't know if that says any difference, whether one's hiring or not. But it shows that they neither had an incentive to have an honest conversation of, yeah, we're kind of like manufacturing the news on this. But that's just one example. And so that does raise the question about when you're talking about alliances in space, and will we shed some of the human foibles that we have when we go into space, or will we carry them into space? And I loved what you said, Divya, about trust is hard to do at global scale. And that's partly just going back to our evolutionary roots that, back when we were, 75,000 years ago, it was our immediate family members, and it was the people we saw. And that at most you met 20 people in your lifespan that were not your immediate family members, where I would submit, barring current pandemic aside, that in normal life, you're probably meeting 20 people on a daily basis that are not your family members. And so we are in a cognitively different environment than what our brains were used to 75,000 years ago. That's why trust is hard. And so as we go to space, I am hopeful for two things. I'm hopeful that the good news is the United States is not going it alone in space, that they're very intentional about the Artemis Accords, and that we have partners going from UAE to, there's now talk about South Korea, that South Korea is going to be joining as well, and Australia. And so I'm excited that we're not going it alone. But I do wonder, because we've seen, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, where China and Russia have said that they're going to work together on a moon base. They're not part of the Artemis Accords. And then you've got folks like Bezos and Elon Musk, saying they're going to get to the moon. So how do we avoid a future in which space is only privileged, or it's just mineral extraction at the waste of actually what the sanctity of space is? I'd be interested in your thoughts, Divya, about how can we make sure the benefits of space exploration uplift everybody?
I think it goes back to what you said, which was intentionality. If we just let it evolve naturally, that's exactly what's going to happen. In fact, the potential for resource extraction on the lunar surface, which involves everything to rare metals to water ice extraction, will basically give the entity that can control those resources control of what's called cislunar space, basically the part of space that's very, very close to the moon, which becomes a really good place to actually launch other missions to places like the asteroids, which are also incredibly resource rich. And if you think about this in terms of a geopolitical extension of what, for instance, China's doing on the planet, and they're not timid about telling people about it, but this Belt Road Initiative, which involves basically spreading across both land-based and sea-based trade routes. And once you control the economics, you kind of control everything, right? And that's kind of what's happening to space. It's being looked at as a resource-rich space, commercialization space. So you have these tensions, and in fact, I feel like some of the tensions where people are afraid to act out on the planet's surface are being moved to the moon, right? So you create an alliance amongst two entities that, for instance, may feel left out of other Western alliances, and perhaps they end up duking it out on the moon by extension. And that's not going to be a very good thing, because it's a very hostile environment. We're going to need a lot of cooperation. One of the things in the Artemis Accords is actually support of an astronaut that's in trouble, whether or not they're from your nation, right? Another important piece of it is actually there's a communications piece, and there's an interoperability piece. There's a data sharing piece. How do you mesh all of these things if you have these sorts of tensions in that place? And then to bring up the other thing that I think is a little bit scary is some of the corporations going up there are actually considering this as their way to untether from the idea of nation states on the planet. And I am going to say that several of them are actually thinking about creating their own version of nation states going out. And like you said, elite and privileged, they have the funds to do it. They'll control the transport systems, the extraction systems. So really, what's to stop them? And so my positive spin on this is we have a chance as we go out and really become that exploratory spacefaring species to get this right. to kind of look back on Earth and say, hey, we made a few mistakes here. We just took things constantly from the land. We didn't share as well. And we created artificial divisions that did not need to exist. And can we be a slightly more evolved and social species going forward and also care for the resources, whether it's the moon, asteroids, Mars? We think they're infinite. Nothing's really infinite. So
well said, and maybe sort of to try and bring things to a close, because we definitely had a great journey. We've gone from bio to the world of digital and cyber to space. I think you said it quite well with space in terms of, can we demonstrate the ability to learn as a species and go beyond tribalism, especially given that the last 5 years seems to have been a resurgence of tribalism, at least in Western societies. And unfortunately, we're hearing now, of course, other countries around the world may also be having tribalistic tendencies come back. Can we have at least what we've heard from astronauts that have been into space is when they turn back and they look at that pale blue dot, it's almost a sense of awe that on that
planet, overview effect.
Yes, exactly. And maybe what we need to do is just get a camera in space that's giving us a 24/7 image, so that whenever we're like having a heated dispute, it's just like, take a look at that image. On that pale blue dot is everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone who ever lived is on that dot. And so, yes, you may be disputing, but remember, we're all alone in the night at the moment, as far as we know. Maybe there's someone, maybe there are other things out there in the galaxy, but at the moment, it is us, and we're surrounded by a fairly, like you said, space is a very unforgiving place. And if we're not careful, instead of actually coming together as a planet, we may pull ourselves apart. But
so we've just created the new VR experience, right? It helps to give everybody this sort of sense of interconnectedness, of awe, of wonder. It's so beautiful. It's a scary place, but it's so stunningly beautiful. And you really see the Earth as such a precious jewel without a single boundary.
Well said. And yes, what we need to do is engineer for awe. Maybe if we can do that, if we can have the combination through narratives, conversations, virtual reality. The fact that, again, I miss when we were able to break bread together before the pandemic, Divya, but I always enjoy these conversations with you. I want to give thanks and to all our listeners as we try to encourage people at the Atlantic Council. Please be bold, please be brave and benevolent for the future ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.